Hello and welcome to another episode of LowEndBox TV. I am your host, Raindog308, and today we're going to do something just for fun, something perhaps a bit controversial. We're going to rank all of the major operating systems and distributions that you could run on your VPS using TierMaker. Of course, it goes without saying, this is just my opinion, it's just for fun, but I do think that sorting through these will give you some insight, or at least one man's opinion, about which OS to use on your VPS. Now, I've created 5 categories here, going from Legend all the way down to Get Outta Here, and we will sort these distributions. I've got them organized with their logos going alphabetically. I want to say also, I'm doing this in April 2021, and it's interesting how topical this is, or how time sensitive this is, because you think about the changes that have happened with CentOS recently. I would probably give very different ratings last fall than I would this spring. So anyway, let's dive into this just for fun. Let's see, first going left to right, top to down, we've got Alma Linux. Now this is the replacement for CentOS. I guess it's good that we just jump right into the CentOS issue. So for those who don't know, in earlier this year, CentOS made a big change. Previously, CentOS was upstream of RedHat Linux. It was downstream of RedHat Linux. So RedHat Linux, they made all the changes. They kind of got everything fully baked in RedHat Linux, and then CentOS copied RedHat Linux, right? It was essentially RedHat Linux without the logo and some other kind of copyrighted bits. But what's happened is they've changed it now so that CentOS is upstream of Red Hat Linux, which means that you're not getting the same promises of, hey, this is going to be fully compatible with Red Hat Enterprise Linux. This is not going to be bit for bit identical to Red Hat Linux. We're not compiling it the same way. It might have different patches. It is now more of a development platform than it was previously. So that really changes the value equation for that. Well, not everybody likes that, right? In fact, most people don't. Most people want essentially Red Hat for free. That was the CentOS value proposition. So a couple companies have come out and organizations have come out and said, well, we're going to provide that. We're going to continue to do what CentOS used to do. And we'll talk more about how Red Hat changed when we get to Red Hat. But we'll start with Alma Linux. Now, one that's not on this list is Rocky Linux, because it's not out yet. So I didn't think it was fair to put it on here. But it will be a similar thing. But Alma Linux is from Cloud Linux. They make some great products, and I have a lot of faith in them. So I'm actually going to put them into Solid, just because I think they're right out of the gate. They're going to be a solid contender, because essentially it is CentOS. It's the CentOS. Essentially it is Red Hat Linux. So I'm pretty. If it was just another community, I might be a little bit less confident. But I have a lot of confidence in Cloud Linux. We actually did a great interview on LowEndBox with the CEO of Cloud Linux. You should definitely check it out. It was a great interview. So we're going to put that one in Solid. Let's go next to Alpine. Now, Alpine is one I personally don't have experience with. I've experienced with most of the OSs on this list, but I can't say I do with Alpine. However, Alpine was about 3-4 years ago, might even be longer, Docker switched from using Ubuntu as its base template. So it used to be when you would create a Docker, I shouldn't say when you created one, when you downloaded most images from Docker Hub, they were based on Ubuntu. Now they switched it to being based on Alpine. And that's done for a couple reasons. I think mainly because the Alpine image is so much smaller than the Ubuntu image. So that helps them just with their network costs, if nothing else. And it helps you as a user because you don't have so much bloat on your in your containers, and also it helps from a security perspective. There's just less stuff to attack. So given that, I'm going to put Alpine here in the solid category. I haven't used it myself, but Docker seems to trust it. I've heard good things about Alpine. All right, let's go for Arch. That's the next one. Again, I've played with Arch. I have not used it a lot. Is this I don't think it's a Legend, because I just don't think it has that much brain share out there. Is it a Oh, is it a solid or is it a hipster only? I'm going to put that actually in solid. I hear a lot of good things about Arch. It is has a reputation for stability, and I think it's a well-designed system. When I've played with it, I liked Pac-Man. It is, I mean, there's a substantial community behind it, so let's put that in solid. All right, now CentOS Classic. I'm differentiating here between CentOS Classic and CentOS Stream. CentOS Classic is CentOS up to version 8. CentOS 8 is the last version of CentOS that's going to be downstream from RedHat. So, is that a solid? I mean, it is pretty solid. I'm going to put that up there in solid, but you know, it kind of feels like a fading star, because sure, it's current now, but in a couple years, it's going to be out of date. Yeah, you know, I'm afraid I'm going to put that into fading star. It's a good choice for today, but 2-3 years from now, it will probably no longer be a good choice. And that, of course, leads us to CentOS Stream. You know what? I'm going to put that in Get Outta Here. Just because I just don't see that it's a weird value proposition. Now, you know, I can see what IBM's doing, right? They're tired of providing a free OS to the world. And there are a lot of companies out there, a lot of companies, smaller organizations, universities, hobbyists who say, I really want RedHat, but I don't want to pay for it. So they use CentOS. So IBM has said, we don't make any money if you do that. So if you want to use it, you've got to pay. And we'll keep CentOS Stream out there, but it's upstream of RedHat, so we're going to be doing development work in there. So you really can't get any more what you want. You can't get RedHat for free. Sort of you can. We'll talk about that when you get to RedHat. But I think CentOS Stream is just, there's not much of a point to it anymore, unless you're doing Linux development work, unless you're coming out with new device drivers or something. It's certainly not something I would run on my VPS, so I'm going to put that in Get Outta Here. All right, moving on. Debian. Oh, that's got to be a legend. All right, that is our first legend for sure. Debian is... man, that is my go-to for VPSs. I remember, I was thinking back, just came into my mind here. Gosh, this probably goes back 4 or 5 years on LowEndTalk, which is the sister forum for LowEndBox. Conversation with a couple guys about how small we could make Debian, and I think we had it down just by turning off services and this kind of stuff, how small we could make the resident memory. And I think we were down to something like 5 megabytes. We might have been down to 4 megabytes. It is perfect for small VPSs. The most recent version, Debian 10, probably wants a little bit more memory, but of course today, your typical VPS, it's hard to find one that doesn't start with at least 512 megs. So Debian, you know, it's lean and mean. It has just this vast package management system. It's got a very good process for going from dev to stable, etc. And then of course they backport stuff, so you can get security fixes. It doesn't have as long a support lifecycle as some of these others. We'll talk about that when we get to Ubuntu. But I remember 3-4 years ago, DreamHost, which is a very large hosting company, moved all of their hosting servers from Debian to Ubuntu just because Ubuntu long-term support, I think, is a 5-year, or maybe it's a 3-year, whereas Debian is smaller than that. I don't remember if it's a 2-year or a 3-year. So if you need that kind of long-term support, Debian might not be the best choice, but for your average hobbyist, your average VPS user, I think Debian is the way to go. And to be honest with you, there's a ton of people still running, Debian 6, Debian 7. It just keeps working. I like Debian quite a bit. It's kind of my home OS, so we're going to put Debian there in the legend. Next up would be Fedora. Yeah, I mean, as a desktop OS, and again, this is for VPSs, which is why you don't see Mint on here, for example. I think Mint is a great desktop or laptop OS. I wouldn't run on my VPS, and I'm going to put Fedora there as well. The only reason Fedora is on here and Mint isn't is because you see Fedora in a lot of provider templates. You go in to say, all right, what OS do I want to put on my VPS, and a lot of times Fedora is in there, and I see people using Fedora. But, you know, Fedora comes with all of the graphical user stuff. Now, if you're trying to do kind of a cloud desktop thing, all right, that makes sense. But most people are using their VPSs to do web services, you know, development work, VPNs, running game servers, and I just don't think Fedora is the right choice there. It's too hard to secure because it's got all the stuff turned on. You're chewing up a ton of memory to do things like, you know, a screensaver and other, you know, desktop kind of things. I think it's just the wrong choice, so I'm going to put that in Get Outta Here. Before we continue, I'd like to highlight one of our community advertisers. Dedepath offers virtual private servers and dedicated servers in Los Angeles, New York, Las Vegas, Jacksonville, or Dallas. They also offer specialized hosting solutions for Forex, SEO, and high bandwidth needs. Their VPS solutions offer unmetered bandwidth with fast SSD disk. Dedepath consistently offers some of the most aggressive pricing in their market segments and can offer Asia-optimized bandwidth, 10 gigabit per second connections, IPv6, and advanced DDoS protection. If you're in the market for a dedicated or virtual server, be sure to check out Dedepath's offers on LowEndTalk or LowEndBox, or visit their website at dedepath.com. All right, if you don't recognize the next one, it's because you're not a BSD guy. This is FreeBSD, and there's 3 BSDs on this list: FreeBSD, NetBSD, and OpenBSD. FreeBSD, I'm going to have to put in, that's at least a solid. Is it a legend? Yeah, I think of the BSDs, it's going to be the legend. FreeBSD is by far the largest community of BSD users. Very, very solid OS. I mean, the only downside to FreeBSD compared to Linux distributions is there's just less community support because the community is smaller. There's less kind of cookbooks and recipes out there. You know, really, if you wanted to run anything for Linux on Ubuntu or Debian or CentOS, there's probably a dozen tutorials. Not so much with FreeBSD. There are certainly a lot of community support, don't get me wrong, and the documentation tends to be much better for FreeBSD. Also, FreeBSD, and this is true of NetBSD and OpenBSD also, are the full distribution. I mean, it's all under one tent, let me put it to you that way. What I mean by full distribution, you know, if you're using CentOS or Debian or really any Linux distro, you are using this sort of patchwork. You know, one team is providing the kernel, another team like this, the GNU project, is providing all these binaries and stuff, and these other projects are providing other pieces that you're using. With FreeBSD or any of the BSDs, it's one team that is providing the base, everything from the kernel to the system utilities to a lot of the basic utilities. And then, of course, you can, obviously, you could use Nginx or Apache or whatever. You know, they're not providing those, but the basic OS is one kind of consistent block. So you get consistent documentation, you get consistent interfaces between the kernel and the userland stuff. It's a nice system from a consistency and a documentation and a well, you don't get things that are conflicting or different standards, right? You know, for example, there's some documentation in Linux where you go in and you say, all right, man, whatever. Oh, I need to go look at the info doc. That's where the documentation lives. And it'd be okay, I think, if everything in Linux was info, but most things are not unless they're GNU, right? Whereas for FreeBSD, everything is one documentation system because it's one team bringing it to you. That's one example. But, you know, FreeBSD really is a very, very solid operating system, very performant. It's a great system. It's not my preferred BSD, but we'll get into that when we get into this hipster stuff. Okay, and speaking of hipster stuff, our next one is probably the ultimate hipster distro, and that is Gentoo. You know, Gentoo is essentially building your system from source with a lot of help. There's a project out there called Linux from Scratch, and if you're a Linux person, if you like Unix, it's worth going through it once just to have the experience of literally starting with nothing and compiling and building each component of your system, bootstrapping the entire system. It's kind of fun, but What Gentoo does is they automate a lot of that. So they provide these recipe files that kind of guide the compilation and are the package manager. It's called emerge. So you would type, or maybe that's not the name, that's the command. Maybe I don't know what the name of their package manager is, but you would type, emerge Apache whatever, and it goes out, downloads the Apache binaries, configures them, compiles them, and puts them on your system. It's kind of a cool way of doing it. What happens, unfortunately, is that some people say, well, I'm going to turn on all these extra compilation flags so that I get better performance. And a lot of times, you're not really getting better performance. In fact, sometimes you can be introducing problems. But if you stick with just kind of the basics in Gentoo, it's actually a really nice OS. I ran this OS on some servers for a long time just because I liked the way it laid things out. But today, yeah, we're going to put that in the Hipster Only. Hipster Only. All right, next up is NetBSD. Now, NetBSD is famous for running on virtually everything. That is really their mission, is to have an operating system for every chip, every platform that is out there. In fact, there was a board, I think it was called a PC532. This was a board that was made in the 1990s, early 90s. It's a 486 board, I think. It might even be the late 80s. I think it's the early 90s. That board, there were only about 500 of them made. And, today, how many can even be left that still function yet? Until pretty recently, NetBSD supported it. You think, wow, they are really going for complete coverage. A board that, there really were probably no more at peak, maybe 100 users. Well, NetBSD has not gotten the same community or user base, even remotely, as FreeBSD. It is, of the BSDs, it is by far the smallest base. I just don't think there's a lot of energy in the NetBSD community. There are definitely some people who love to use it. It has very friendly licensing terms, so I still run into it sometimes. Sometimes in packaged consumer hardware that you'll look under the covers, you'll find it's actually NetBSD running because they liked the simplicity of it, and they didn't need some of the more complex features that you'd get from other distributions, and maybe they'd say, hey, let's use NetBSD for our project. But I just don't know that it tends to lag behind in a lot of areas. I want to say Hipster Only, but really, to me, I can't say it's a fading star. I think it is a fading star. It is a long fading star. I don't think NetBSD is going anywhere anytime soon, and I know that one is going to inspire some negative comments. But I just think that it's a product that is slowly dying, and there's just not a lot of dynamism in its how frequently they do releases, how much, I don't think they have a lot of developers. You could make a case for Hipster Only, but I think that's a fading star. All right, next up is Tux in a suit of armor. Yeah, this is Oracle Enterprise Linux. Oracle Enterprise Linux is essentially it's Red Hat Linux, maybe with a couple Oracle specific patches. And I should give some props to Oracle because they have released some software. The Oracle cluster file system is out in the Linux kernel and some stuff like that. So they have contributed some things to the community, but let's be honest, this is a way of saying, hey, you can buy your support contract from Oracle instead of from Red Hat. That's really all this is. And there's been a bit of a back and forth between them and Red Hat. Red Hat has changed some of the way they do patching or introduce patches to make it more difficult for Oracle to reverse engineer. So I don't know. I think that unless you have a really specific reason for running Oracle Enterprise Linux, I would say get out of here. And, I actually support a lot of Oracle software in my day job, and I'm very familiar with Oracle as a company. And I just don't, again, if you're going to be running the Oracle database or some kind of, Oracle software, maybe it would be best to run Oracle Linux. But for everybody else, and really, you're not going to be running the Oracle database on your VPS unless you've got more money than God. So I think you can give that one a pass. Now, next up is OpenBSD. That is Puffy, the OpenBSD logo. OpenBSD is a beautiful operating system because it is designed to do the right thing. That means perfect security, where they can, they try to make security as locked down as possible. Perfect documentation. There is no OS on this list, or even commercial OSs like Solaris or whatever, that has better documentation than OpenBSD. I mean, if there is something in the documentation that doesn't line up with the code, it's considered a bug. People open bug reports and it gets fixed. Their code is beautiful to look at. They are continuously auditing their code. They run fuzzers. They have guys going through and just doing a continuous cycle of audits. There are not many remote holes that appear in OpenBSD. I think they said now they've had 2 in a very long time. For years it was like 1 in the last 8 or 9 years or whatever. Then they had another one, but that's just a record that's unmatched by anyone else. I can't tell you how many times I have seen bug reports come out and say, hey, this is a critical vulnerability, and oh yeah, OpenBSD is not vulnerable, or yeah, OpenBSD fixed this issue years ago. The sudo bug that was out recently, where any user on a system could get root, essentially. OpenBSD saw the problems with sudo years ago and replaced it with their own replacement, doas, and that's just an example of one of many, many examples. OpenBSD, however, is kind of a research OS. They are pushing the boundary and bringing in their ideas, but it's not. They're not trying to be the most performant OS on the planet. They're not trying to support all sorts of different operating systems or even platforms. Until recently, you could not run OpenBSD on Raspberry Pis just because they don't like binary blobs for device drivers. They want to get in there and see what the device driver is doing, right? So it's going to have to go into the hipster only. I think actually, if you are trying to be well-informed on operating systems, you want to be a well-rounded Unix person, you want to understand how operating systems work, I think it's worth spending some time with OpenBSD. I mean, the other choices that are going to go in, or already are in the hipster-only category, you can kind of play with them or not, but I think definitely OpenBSD is enough of a different beast than everything else that's on the planet that it's worth spending your time. And also consider how many products and projects have come out of OpenBSD that are used by other Linux distributions or BSD distributions. I mean, you've got OpenSSH, OpenSMTP, OpenNTP. You've got the firewall, actually the firewall for the Mac, for your iPhone, everything, that all is from PF, which is the OpenBSD firewall. And the list just goes on. So it's a great OS, but it is definitely not something that your average Linux user or your average user who wants to sit down and install a web server and get going is going to use. That's just the reality. Simply because it is different enough, and it's kind of a small but rather tight community. You don't tend to find a lot of tutorials around OpenBSD. Now, they would say, hey, you don't need tutorials, just read the man pages, right? But it's just not it's not an OS designed for the masses, let me put it that way. Next, we've got Tux with a communist flag here. We've got Red Flag Linux. I think you would only use this distro if the Chinese government forced you to use it. There's Asian UX and some other distributions that are more popular in Asia, but I've never run into anybody who uses Red Flag Linux outside of China, I don't think. It is, and I could be wrong about that, no doubt. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments, or if I'm missing some glorious part of Red Flag Linux, let me know. But I think this is a distribution primarily aimed at the Chinese market, and probably more for governmental reasons than while we've looked at all of them, and this is the one that we think is the best. So I'm going to put that in Get Outta Here. Next, we've got RedHat, and this, I'm talking about Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Now, again, I said I'm making this in spring of 2021. If this was fall of 2020, I would have a very different place for this. But Red Hat Enterprise Linux, for your VPS, if you're a hobbyist, you can now run RHEL on up to 16 VMs for free. And I believe it, I haven't done this yet, but I believe you sign up with an email account and an address, and that's what ties your subscription. So you probably could run as many as you want just with multiple emails. I don't know how that all works, but if you're playing Square, you've got 16 different systems that you can run RHEL on. I think that's awesome for the professional, or let's say you're a junior system administrator and you want to learn more about Unix, or you're studying for the RHCE or something. This is a great opportunity to get in there and play with Red Hat and have all the full power of it. Second of all, if you just want a really stable operating system, I'm not a big fan personally of RPM systems. I think it's a lot easier to run Debian just because there's more packages available. There's more well, that's mainly it. I mean, there's more packages available. It's easier to set up web servers, that kind of stuff. And RHEL comes out of the box with a lot of stuff that is, I don't know, it seems to me to be kind of change for change's sake. Now, some people say these changes are awesome. I mean, Systemd comes from RHEL, FirewallD comes from RHEL, SE Linux, well, it didn't come from RHEL, but I think RHEL was the first one to really put it in their OS years ago. So to me, it always feels like I'm stepping a little bit onto alien territory when I jump on a RHEL box, but I'm sure that a hardcore CentOS or RHEL user stepping into Debian would have the same experience. I'm going to put Red Hat. It is such a highly influential OS. I'm going to put that up here in Legend. Now, again, it is one of the big OSs out there, no doubt about it. And it's certainly a solid system, and I think the fact that you've got the opportunity now to run it for free makes it much more appealing to the hobbyist user. So, IBM kind of shuffled things around. I think they really screwed up the CentOS thing. I can't imagine ever using CentOS again, but they've kind of opened the door with RHEL. And interestingly enough, I can just say they've done this with some of their other products. For example, DB2, which is not a database that's very widely used, well, certainly not by VPS hobbyists, but they've really made the Express Edition where you can, download a kind of a limited version. They've really expanded the limits of that and what you can do with it, to the point where I think a lot of people could run free versions of that very successfully and never run into those limits. Unlike, for example, Oracle's the Express edition of their database, or Microsoft's SQL Express. I think you can run those, but you'll pretty quickly run into the limitations. IBM seems to give you a little bit more generous limitations on their free offerings because, IBM really, as a company, the money for them is in working with the General Motors, the Toyotas, the Coca-Colas, the big companies of the world that need their services, not some hobbyists. So I think they're trying to capture a little bit of mind share here, and by giving a little bit more power on their free stuff. All right, next up, let me take a sip here a second. Next up, we have Slackware, and a kind of unusually attractive logo for Slackware. I was looking for Slackware logos. This one kind of jumped out at me because it was so polished. Slackware is one of the oldest distributions. I mean, tell you how old I am. I remember back in the early 90s, this is like 1993, 1994, downloading these floppies, right? And I remember there was like A1, A2, N1, I think, had the news, as in Usenet, back when Usenet was still a thing, right? There were several floppies that had the development tools, several floppies that were like the base, some floppies that had web servers, or that actually 1993, 1994, did we even really have web servers? I don't remember. But there were you went to the Slackware site and you downloaded these images and you put them on floppies, and then you turned around and you fed those floppies one after another into your probably 386, 486 at that time. Maybe it could have been a Pentium in the early 90s. And that's how you bootstrapped your Slackware system. Classic OS, I don't think it is nearly as popular. I mean, it was, even by the mid to late 90s, it was being overtaken by slicker systems, to be honest with you. But it's still a good system. I've played with Slackware over the years, and it still works. I mean, it's a great system for people who like to really get in under the hood and tinker with their stuff. And so for that, and I don't think I would not put it in fading star, because it's I think it's a OS that is going to be around for probably forever. And it's like I said, there's a certain segment of the market it appeals to. I don't know. I think maybe, now that I think about this, people who really like to tinker, I think that the Slackware is going to continue to appeal to those folks. I'm going to go ahead and put that into Hipster Only, just because it's not a huge distro, but it's got a passionate core. All right, next up we have SuSE. Does anyone still use SuSE? I think people do. There's OpenSuSE and SuSE. I have a feeling, or I've read, that this is bigger in Europe. You never see this in the U.S. really at the enterprise level. Of course, I say that, and someone's going to pop up and say, "Oh, my company, we've got 1,000 of these." But unless you're buying software from some vendor in Europe, you're probably not going to run SuSE in North America. I don't get a sense that even in Europe, I just don't see a whole lot of conversation about SuSE in forums. I don't see a lot of people saying, "Oh yeah, OpenSuSE is where it's at." And you just don't run into it very much. I mean, it's out there, but I don't know. You guys can disagree, but I'm going to put it under fading star. I just don't think I think it's got a long tail, because there's a lot of commercial software that is running on it, and in those kind of relationships, you don't care so much about the OS, right? If you're going to go spend $500,000 for some big software package, you don't care so much about the OS that it runs on. You really care more about what the application is going to do. And so there are some of those products that SuSE is the go-to, and so it'll be around for a long time. But I just don't see it as a vibrant, growing community. But maybe I'm missing some activity in other parts of the world. Let me know. Finally, we've got Ubuntu. Man, this is a big one. Ubuntu is a Debian-based distro by Canonical. They kind of gutsy it up a bit. That's what I think of when I think of Debian. Debian's kind of lean and mean, and if you make it a bit more user-friendly, it's Ubuntu. Or if you put a little bit more lipstick on it, it's Ubuntu. Ubuntu is I still run into a lot of people who use Ubuntu. It is much different than Fedora. Fedora, I don't see as many people in forums saying, "Oh yeah, I'm running Fedora," or just saying, "Here's how you do this in Fedora." That's how you can kind of tell that a distro is very popular, is someone will just start a thread or start a post by saying, "Hey, I'm having this problem," or "Here's how I do my web servers. Now on Ubuntu I just do this," or "On Debian I do this," or "On CentOS I do this." You don't see people saying that with Fedora, right? It's just people are not using it as much on the OS or on the VPS. But for Ubuntu, there are a lot of people who use it. I just don't know. Let's see here. It's definitely not Hipster Only or anything below that. Is it Solid or Legend? Yeah, this is going to be kind of a judgment call. I'm going to put it in Solid. Now, I know some people will hate that and they'll say, "Oh, you're nuts. It's big," and it is big. Don't get me wrong. If I were to rate these within this group, and I haven't really done this, this is kind of how I would put things within these tiers. On the Legend, I would put Debian first, RedHat, and then FreeBSD probably quite a bit behind. For Solid, I'd put Ubuntu at the top, probably Alma coming up just because I think it's going to be huge. And Rocky Linux would be in there also. So almost kind of a placeholder for people who want CentOS Classic going forward. And then probably Arch and Alpine. And then Hipster Only. Are there more Gentoo users than OpenBSD users? I don't know. That's probably pretty accurate. I don't know. Gentoo seems to... Gentoo could almost be in Fading Star. I'm going to put them like that. And then for Fading Star down here, I don't know enough about SuSE the more I think about it, but I think that's probably pretty accurate. These are all pretty equivalent, I think. And Get Outta Here, that's all pretty accurate. That's all pretty equivalent. Now, I will finish up by saying that if you are a passionate NetBSD user or a passionate Oracle Enterprise Linux user, don't take this as an insult to your distribution. Also, you might have some really good reason for running one of these other distributions, or maybe it just works for you, or maybe you've been using that same distro for 20 years or something. If so, party on. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Many of these... this tier ranking just reflects the incredible diversity. If you go back in time, the idea that you would have, how many we got here? 4, 7, 10, 14, 17 different distributions. And of course, there's over 100 Linux. Actually, I read once there's over 1,000 different Linux distributions that are out there. I don't know how many are actively maintained, but add in however many BSD distributions there are, not to mention stuff like, Open Solaris. I didn't even put that on here, but that is out there too. There is just a tremendous diversity of free software that's out there. So it's kind of a meme, but it's a great time to be alive from a software perspective because we have so many options. So this was just for fun. This is just my opinion. If you disagree, I encourage you to comment below. And as always, I would invite you to come visit us on LowEndBox, where you can find fantastic deals on hosting, more technical content like this, and some interviews with some of the leaders in the industry, and a lot of lively discussion. And speaking of lively discussion, I should also mention LowEndBox, our sister site, LowEndTalk, which is where we talk about technology, Linux, hosting, and just about everything else. So please come visit us on LowEndBox and LowEndTalk. And until next time, happy hosting.